Her resiliency is not uncommon, but very little research has been done on this topic, and thus much remains to be explored about children who have experienced parental incarceration without negative outcomes. Apart from resiliency, another reason why parental incarceration may be difficult to pinpoint as the reason why children may exhibit undesirable behavior, have school difficulties, or have symptoms of psychological problems is that it is difficult to tease the effect of parental incarceration apart from other traumas and adversities many children of incarcerated parents experience. The negative outcomes observed among these children are likewise found among children exposed to these other circumstances, even in the absence of parental incarceration. For instance, research has shown that children whose parents are substance abusers have similar outcomes as those documented in many studies of children incarcerated parents, even if those substance abusers never go to prison. Exposure to different forms of violence, whether in the community or at home, likewise places children at risk of these same outcomes. In fact, we know that many children grow up in environments where they are exposed to multiple factors associated with the risk of undesirable outcomes. And research in various domains has shown that children facing multiple risks are more vulnerable than children who might have to deal with just one risk factor, such as parental incarceration or parental substance abuse. And the same is true about research on children of incarcerated parents, some of which has shown that ill effects were observed only in children who faced multiple risks. In light of this, it's important to consider children's lives from a broader perspective, to put incarceration in proper context with the rest of children's lives, especially because many children whose parents are imprisoned are known to come from households where they face multiple risks. So this slide shows factors in a variety of domains that shape a child's life before a parent's incarceration, as well as those that might mitigate or exacerbate how the child copes with and reacts to the parent's absence during the period of imprisonment. But don't worry, I'm not going to go over this entire slide. But if we just look at a couple of the domains on the pre-incarceration side, we can better understand how there's a multitude of situations that characterize children's lives before a parent is incarcerated, and that these are highly relevant to understanding children's risk and resilience. For instance, just let's consider some demographic factors and family situations. In one scenario, we might have a child who's never lived with a parent who goes to prison. That child's reaction to the incarceration is liable to be very different than one who spent his entire life with the parent who leaves for prison. In fact, in the National Prisoners Survey that I mentioned earlier, fewer than half the incarcerated parents reported that they'd been living with their minor children before they were incarcerated. And only 35% of men in prison today said they'd been living with their children during the month before they were arrested. So there's a tremendous amount of separation between the children and the incarcerated parents before they even are incarcerated. Their absence due to incarceration, therefore, may be much less disruptive than would otherwise be the case if the family had been living together. Similarly, an infant will likely be affected quite differently by a parent's imprisonment than would, say, a 9-year-old who'd spent her entire life with her parent prior to the parent's incarceration, even though the parent-child separation, in the case of the infant, has serious implications for the infant's development and the development of the relationship between the infant and the child. These are quite basic characteristics, but if we look at some of the other domains here, we see that many are known to contribute to heightened risk for children, such as parental substance abuse, mental illness, or criminal behavior, which we know is associated with increased risk of delinquency, even in the absence of parental incarceration. So Nancy, for example, quoted that statistic about 65% of boys whose parents were convicted. That's convicted. We're not sure if they were sentenced to prison or not, but it's a very high, we know that parental criminality is a very strong predictor of children's delinquency. So how likely are children of incarcerated parents to be confronted with some of these other risks? Well, this slide shows the prevalence of problematic behaviors or circumstances before incarceration among parents in prison. I guess I got a little gender crazy here, so I used pink and red for the women and blue and light blue and dark blue for the men. But the red and pink bars do represent the mothers, the blue the fathers, and in both cases the lighter shaded bars represent parents who were living with their children, and the darker show parents who did not live with their children before imprisonment. Although women have higher prevalence rates than men in every category, both men and women report very high rates of substance abuse. As you can see, for mothers who didn't live with their children, it exceeds 80%, but for everybody else, it's very high, above 60%. And also mental health problems, especially among women, which are both known to heighten risks for children. Furthermore, women report high rates of both physical and sexual victimization. And as I said before, research shows that exposure to such violence is harmful to children as well. In addition to having parents with high rates of these behavioral and health problems, children of incarcerated parents have very high rates of poverty, as the title of a book in the United States goes, "The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison." And indeed, it is the case that most people in prison, the poverty rates in prison are much higher than in the general population. And we know that children who grow up in poverty fare far worse than other children on a number of measures. Of course, it's important to bear in mind that not all children whose parent goes to prison lives with so many potential risks. But for those who do, the reason people are concerned about children of incarcerated parents, apart from the potential damaging effects of parent-child separation, is clear. One might even wonder what might happen to these multiple risk children if their parent never went to prison. For instance, consider this snapshot of an incident involving a 28-year-old mother of 2 children, one of whom was 7 years old at the time of the incident. When I met the mother, she was in jail, awaiting trial on a drug possession charge. At that point, she had been using drugs for about 10 years, including cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and crack. She had been arrested 6 times before a particular incident that she described to me. 2 of those arrests were for aggravated assaults involving her former boyfriend, with whom she lived for 8 years. Aggravated assaults in the United States are serious assaults meant to inflict serious bodily injury. And the 2 had been in what she called a semi-abusive relationship. I'm not sure what constitutes an abusive relationship if this was semi-abusive, but that's what she called it. And he had inflicted various serious injuries on her. Here is how she described what happened one night with her son present. I was high, sitting on the toilet, nodding out. John, who was her boyfriend, came in and told me to move off the toilet. I couldn't, so we started fighting. And she couldn't because she was so high. I picked up a frying pan and a glass. I hit him with both of them, anything else I could find. I stomped him in the mouth. John called the cops, told them I had him knifed. They came, and they was looking for a weapon. The cops said, "She's fucked up," and took me out in my bra. I was fighting them, telling them, take him, but they handcuffed me. Can we say which aspect of this scenario was more damaging to the child? The fact that his mother was too high to get off the toilet when somebody else needed to use it, with all that that implies about the child's entire life experience with a substance-abusing mother. The mother's use of force against her boyfriend, the boyfriend's ongoing and serious abuse of his mother, the trauma of watching his mother get arrested and dragged out to the street in her underwear, handcuffs around her wrists. Certainly the chronic drug use and violence in the household had the potential to traumatize him, and the arrest and the removal of his mother only added to the already fraught environment in which he was growing up. So, those are some of the factors that I think we really need to think about when we think about why children may be so at risk when a parent goes to prison. But having looked at some of the pre-incarceration factors that might put a child at risk, we should also consider how a child's post-incarceration situation might influence adjustment to the incarceration. So if we refer to this slide again, after a parent actually goes to prison, the child's living situation during the imprisonment will also affect their reaction to the event, starting with who the child lives with. In the United States, only a very small percentage of children whose parents are incarcerated end up living in foster care, although children whose mothers are incarcerated are about 5 times more likely to end up in care than those whose fathers are incarcerated. The great majority end up living with a relative, most often with the non-imprisoned parent. Here again, however, we see differences between children of incarcerated mothers and incarcerated fathers. Men are far more likely to be able to rely on the children's mothers to care for them during their incarceration than women can on the children's fathers. Nearly 90% of fathers in prison reported that their children were being cared for by their child's mother, while only 37% of inmate mothers said their child was being cared for by the child's father. Instead, children of women in prison were cared for by grandparents, other relatives, or friends. Continuity of care, staying with your parent, means far less disruption in a child's life, and residing with at least one parent can help mitigate the pain of the loss the child experiences by providing continued love and security. However, the added stress of being a single parent who is also trying to cope with the loss not only of a loved one, but also possibly with a significant loss of income, can put extraordinary strains on a family. In addition to the child's living situation, his or her adjustment is liable to be affected by the amount of contact with the imprisoned parent during their incarceration. Unfortunately, for far too many children, contact with their parent is difficult at best, and the situation can be exacerbated by the policies of the prison and the state's corrections department. The easiest way for a parent and child to communicate is probably through phone calls. Of course, the child cannot simply pick up the phone and call the parent when some significant event happens, when they got a good grade or when they scored the winning goal or when they got in a fight on the schoolyard or anything like that, because prisoners can't receive phone calls. Instead, the prisoner himself must call, and all calls must be paid for by the person receiving the call, which we call collect calls in the United States. Collect calls are charged at higher rates than regular calls. In addition, the common practice in most prisons in the United States is to provide phone calls through a private phone company that assesses surcharges on every call, making each call far more expensive than a call from another phone in the same geographic location would normally be. In fact, the cost of these calls can be so high that they become prohibitively expensive for families caring for the children. During my research on children of incarcerated mothers, I spoke with one grandmother who was caring for her 2 granddaughters while both their mother and father were incarcerated for long sentences in prison. The children's father insisted on calling home nearly every day, and the grandmother, who was the mother of the father, accepted all his calls. And she was living on a very meager, fixed income, and the cost of the calls was so high that she felt she could not also afford to accept calls from the girl's mother, so she blocked the calls, and as a result, the children never got to speak to their mother. As the grandmother put it, she had to make a choice between letting the girls talk to their mother or buy them winter jackets, so she opted to keep them warm, at least physically. Probably the most meaningful contact can occur face-to-face when children come to visit. But here again, there are considerable obstacles. Most prisons in the United States are located in rural or semi-rural areas far from the metropolitan regions where a majority of prisoners come from, and reaching them can be a challenge. In addition, people imprisoned in federal prisons, though far fewer than state prisons, can be incarcerated anywhere in the United States, often at great distance from their home. To give you some sense of how far distant prisoners can be from their children, consider this map. This is a map of the United States, or the continental United States, and the state of Oklahoma is right there in the center of the bullseye there. They recently undertook a survey, quite extraordinary, to determine where prisoners' children lived and where the parent was incarcerated. I don't know of other states that have done anything like this. The green dots on the map represent where the children live, and the red dots where their parents are imprisoned. You can just imagine the difficulties families would face if they had to travel to many of these prisons, especially when you consider that the inner circle here has a radius of about 125 miles, while the radius of the middle one is about 225 miles. And if we go to the outer circle, which captures a large number of the places where parents are imprisoned, has a radius of approximately 335 miles. Parents imprisoned on the east or west coast of the United States, as many of them are, according to this map, are roughly 1,500 miles away from Oklahoma, which would make it nearly impossible for a child to visit with any regularity or even ever, because it's extremely expensive. Even where children are closer to the place where their parent is in prison, problems may well exist. Some prisons are inaccessible by public transit. Even in the small state in which I teach, in New Jersey, it's really quite a small state, but the women's prison, for example, is 2 hours away, and you just can't get there by public transit. So it might as well be 1,000 miles away. Driving can be too costly or too time-consuming for many families, assuming they even have a car, which many urban residents do not. Visiting policies and hours can likewise make it inconvenient or difficult to arrange for children's visits. So in the city of Philadelphia, which is where I live, the women's prison had no visiting hours on weekends, although the men's prison did, which meant that you could only bring your child, the child of a woman in the Philadelphia jail, to visit during the week, and visiting hours, you had to have them there by 4:30. So you can just imagine the difficulties of trying to get the child home from school to the prison in order to see the parent in time. So besides these structural barriers to visiting, prisoners themselves may decide to limit visits, feeling that they do not want their children to see them in a prison setting. Caregivers may also believe that children should not be exposed to the prison environment and will decline to take them there. As one grandmother I interviewed said, when discussing her incarcerated daughter's complaint that her children don't come to visit because the grandmother won't take them, "You want to see your kids? Well, stay out of jail. That's how you get to see your kids." For all these reasons, it's perhaps not surprising that nearly 6 in 10 parents in state prison in the United States report that they have never received a visit from their child, and that another nearly 1 in 4 see their child less than once a month. So as I hope has been made clear, there are many circumstances both before and after a parent's incarceration that can exacerbate or possibly mitigate the effects on the children, which may help explain why research has yet to find overwhelming evidence of parental incarceration's harmful effects. That is not meant to minimize the harmful effect of incarceration. Every child I've talked with who's had this experience has been indelibly marked by it, typically carrying great sadness as well as often resentment and anger about having missed the shared experiences that bind a parent and child together. Children are also keenly aware that they are marked as different from other children, even those who might be separated from their parent for reasons other than incarceration, such as divorce or military service, neither of which carry the stigma that imprisonment does. That stigma affects not only the children, but also the entire family, as ethnographic studies of prisoners' families have shown us, leading many to increased social isolation as they go through an experience that others cannot fully understand, and brings with it a concomitant loss of social capital as the families become increasingly isolated. The economic impact of incarceration, whether through the loss of income or drains on the family through the added expenses, which can be considerable and are incurred because of the parent's incarceration, can also worsen future prospects for the children. One of the most troubling and potentially consequential collateral consequences of mass incarceration is the idea that it is contributing to the reproduction of inequality, placing children of the incarceration boom at great peril of falling behind other children on numerous social indicators. This is an area that has received relatively little attention, but is certainly worthy of researchers' attention. Is all bleak for children of incarcerated parents? I'd say that the answer to that is of course not. As I said earlier, children are remarkably resilient, and most survive this experience without succumbing to enduring bad behavior or serious mental illness, even though they carry regret and sadness. Although we still have a great deal to learn about children with imprisoned parents, research being conducted in many fields promises to help us better understand children's pathways to undesirable outcomes as well as to resilience. In the United States, we've done, I think, probably not as much as you have here in the UK, but nevertheless, individuals and organizations have come together and helped begin to raise awareness about this issue among policymakers, urging changes that might help mitigate the impact of parental incarceration on children. School districts around the country have begun to recognize the need to support students with incarcerated parents. Some police departments in the United States have begun to implement changes in their arrest procedures to better protect children when a parent is arrested in front of them. Probation and parole officers in some places have begun to request training about dealing with prisoners' children. And even foster care workers in some jurisdictions have acknowledged the need for specific training targeted at working with prisoners' children. There is even a proposed Bill of Rights for children of incarcerated parents in the United States, which calls for children to be heard, recognized, and considered in matters that affect them. Advocates across the nation have been using the proposed Bill of Rights and other strategies to press for change and acknowledgement. So perhaps we're heading toward a future where children of incarcerated parents will no longer be invisible or mute. Thank you.